I'm going to start work on the canopy, and the customer supplied me with the canopy off of his old fish tank, which is great because this old canopy, even though they've got a new tank, will fit the new tank. So these are very basic. It's essentially an L-shaped box. You can see from the back they don't even have a back. It's just an L-shaped box with a hinged lid. Then on the inside there's these spacers so that it could sit on top of the tank, and the only thing he told me to make sure was to keep the height the same, because in order for the filter for the tank to fit, it has to be at this height, which is not a problem. So with the dimensions of this, I'm going to start making the new top, and the new top, the design's a little different. First off, it's going to be made out of birch. It's not going to be stained dark, and the top, the sides come down at an angle, and the top is solid and hinged. There's a flat part in the back, and the front is hinged. So these have like these inside hinges, and the new top will just have hinges on the top. So I'm going to write down the dimensions of this and start cutting my plywood. I cut 2 strips of that birch veneer ply to 6 inches, and now I'm going to cut the front and the 2 sides. And the measurements for this box was 13 3/8 on the sides and 38 inches in the front. So that's the outer dimension. The inner dimensions will fit right on top of that 36 by 12.5 tank. So since it's only an L shape, since this is only an L shape, you're going to want something in the back to hold it together, but also in the front, so I don't want to see this veneer. I'm going to 45 both ends of my plywood and join these joints on a miter, and I'll probably throw a couple of biscuits in there as well. So with those miters, this is what that L-shaped box is going to look like. Now on the design for this one, there's a taper in the front. So I marked about halfway across in my piece and then halfway up in the front. And then I'm going to connect those 2 marks. And that's going to be the taper I want. And then once I have that out cut on both sides, I can rip this front piece down to this height and start putting this together. I ripped down this front piece after putting the taper on these sides, and then I tape my corners together after squaring them up from the inside. That way I could get my inside dimension. And I have a piece of scrap left over from ripping those all down. It's only about 2 inches of that 3/4 inch birch plywood. And that piece I can now cut to size, and it's going to go right back here for support. I have my canopy dry fitted. In the corners I have 1 biscuit, just fell out, just to align this as I put it together. So what I'm going to do is put glue in all these joints and then use tape on the corners to keep everything aligned while checking for square, and then attach that back part and then let this dry. The basic carcass made for the new canopy, I'm now going to add the inside, I'm going to call them cleats for the tank, and they're on either side. One's in the front, and this one's a 1/2 inch thick, and it's 4 inches tall by 2 inches wide, and the one in the back is 3/4 inches thick, and that's also 4 inches tall, but only 1 inch wide. And that one sets back 1.5 inches from the back of the canopy. So I'm going to cut those pieces and add them to mine. Now these ones on theirs, the back one's made out of a hardwood and the front's made out of plywood, but since it's going to be a moist environment, the plywood's kind of peeling on these. So I think I'm going to make both of mine out of hardwood and scrap using plywood for this. So with these blocks in place, I'm now going to start cutting the pieces. There's going to be a solid piece on top here that won't move, but then there's going to be a hinge part right here, obviously with hinges in the tops, where that piece will move. Now I'm going to cut these to size, but I'm not going to attach them yet because I'm going to cover the exposed plies of all this birch veneer with edge banding so you won't see it. Going to be making that edge banding. It's going to be almost like a homemade veneer out of the birch hardstock that I'm getting, and that's not here yet, but I want to start cutting the parts for the top. So I have these scrap pieces of birch veneer from other projects, and I'm going to start by cutting this one, and there's probably going to be about an inch lip on either side, and then there's most likely going to be an angle that has to be cut in the top so these two pieces meet, and then I'll cut the front one as well. Since I freehanded this angle, I'm going to use a sliding bevel to find out what that angle is. Now this one's nice because it's digital, but you can use a regular one to get that angle, and that angle I could transfer it to the back side of my plywood and then cut it. So the one nice thing about that digital gauge is it told me that this angle is 66.5 degrees, which means that if I take 90 and subtract it by 66.5, I get 23.5. Since most people's table saws don't go past 45 degrees, you can't cut this at 65, so you have to find the other angle. So with that 23.5, I could put that on my table saw and then cut it. So I could trim this with that same angle so it leaves a nice edge, and I'm going to leave another probably about 3/4 to an inch overhang, and then this will be ready for edge banding. While my cabinet is drying, I'm going to start working again on the canopy. And all these edges of the canopy are going to have to be veneered with some strips. But before I do that, instead of veneering these, because the edges are going to be round over, I'm going to take this and cut it flush with the edge of my canopy, and then I'm going to make some round over strips and attach them around the sides of this piece as well as the opening lid, so I don't have to worry about veneering, and it would be really hard to veneer on that curve anyway. So I'm going to cut these down. I drew a line on this one and on that one, and then I'm going to start routing some round over and ripping that down as well and attaching it to these pieces. Before I attach that molding to the edges of these pieces, I'm actually going to attach these two pieces together with these surface hinges. So I have 3 of them, and I'm just going to space them evenly on the top, and I'm actually going to make mortises into either of these pieces so there's not really a gap in between them. And then this will be one unit, and it will be easier to align the molding on the sides of this piece. before I mortise the lid, I'm going to be cutting that down to flush with the canopy as well because I left it long. Now originally I had this edge on the front, but I think it's going to be easier to attach the molding without the edge, so I'm cutting this square and flush to the edge of the canopy.
On June 16th, Philadelphia will host the Out of the Darkness Overnight Walk, the largest suicide prevention event in history.
I'm going to be cutting some thin veneer from some of this leftover birch stock, and I'm going to use it to cover all the plies of the canopy. I don't think there's anything I'm going to be using it for on the actual cabinet. So I set my fence up to cut a very thin strip off of that piece of birch, and I'm just going to send this through until I have about enough to cover all these plies. To finish off this canopy, I'm going to be covering all of the exposed plies with this veneer that I just cut out in my shop. And I'm going to be using this fast cap veneer tape, mainly because I don't have a vacuum press, and this stuff works pretty well. So before I put this stuff on, I'm going to clean all my edges with tack cloth to get all the dust off, and then it's simply a matter of just laying out the tape, trimming the tape, and then putting the veneer on. And the veneer is almost the width of my plywood. It's a little bit thicker because this is 3/4 and the plywood's a little thinner than that, so there shouldn't be a ton of trimming. I could probably get away with just sanding the edges once it's all done. So I'm going to start by doing the bottom and then flipping it over and doing the top and the back side. So I had that veneer on the top sides of all of my pieces, as well as you saw me putting it on the bottom and on all the backs. So that's going to cover up all those plies. You're not really going to see any of these parts because the lid's always going to be closed and you're not going to be staring up from the floor on the underside, but it just makes it look nicer if you get rid of those plies. Plus, since this is going to be sitting on top of a fish tank, moisture is going to be an issue. And if you have those exposed plies, the chances of them absorbing a lot more water is not great. But I mean, like this one in the back, I'm not going to bother covering it because this is just a support member. It's mostly when you lift up the lid, the parts you'll see. So now I could put the lid on top and start adding that round trim to it, as well as I could probably attach it. It's going to just be attached on this back part. I put 2 brad nails in the top of this lid on either side just to hold this in place while I start trimming out the edges with this molding. So basically I just cut long strips of this quarter round molding, and I'm just slowly attaching it to the side. As of right now, I'm just using tape and glue to hold it in place. And you could see on this side, this piece was pretty easy. It was a straight piece, but then this side I had to mirror the profile of the top of the cabinet, which was easy. I just lifted this up and traced the other side and then put a 45 on the end. And you could see, because I put a 45 in this long piece, that this is going to match up very nicely. So I'm going to do the same thing to the other side and then cut the final last piece, and then except for some corner molding on both of these sides, this canopy is going to be pretty much done. Popped my hinged lid off and sanded all of these surfaces because it's just easier to do it without that lid on. Now, the last thing I'm going to do before I permanently attach that lid is I'm going to take some of this leftover angles from the base and put it on the back side corners as well as the front side corners, just to finish up those edge and make it match the base a little bit. Reattach this lid to the top with a couple of brads, but to really secure it in place I flipped it upside down and countersunk a couple holes, and I'm going to put 1¼ inch screws into there. That will really secure this back to the lid and also eliminate having to patch a bunch of holes by using brads on the top side. I left the little lip on the back side of this cabinet so I could cover it up with a little piece of trim, and this is just a scrap piece of that birch that I have. You could actually see that it's rough sawn because it was one of the edges, so I'm just going to put some glue on this and some brads and attach that like that. I'm going to leave it long and then hand cut off the edges, and then this piece could be final sanded and then finished just like the cabinet. Then with this cabinet done, I put that white stain on all the parts. Now the stain absorbs into that thin ply much faster and quicker than the hardwood molding. So I wiped it off fairly quickly on the thin ply, but let it soak into the molding a little bit longer. And I'm going to do that on the whole piece just so that when I put the clear coat on it, the clear coat doesn't yellow the finish. It keeps it that kind of stark white color. So after this will be a clear coat and then this is done.